couple of questions for all of you to start things off. How many of you have been to the Delta? Wow, that's awesome. Well, as you know, the Delta is this area right here. It's about 740,000 acres. It's the largest estuary on the west coast of all of the Americas, and by that I mean North and South America. How many of you have been on a boat in the Delta? That's great. Wow, that's a lot. So if you live in the Bay Area, you're pretty much drinking Delta water. The exceptions might be you're either drinking Delta water or you're drinking water from this watershed that's diverted before it can get through the Delta. The exceptions might be if you live in Sonoma or Marin counties, which are a little bit different. So this is a highly altered place, the Delta is. This is kind of zeroed in on that 740,000 acres I talked about. Sacramento's up here. Antioch is about there. This is what it looked like about 200 years ago, and this is roughly what it looks like now. The thing to notice is how many curvy lines there are on the left-hand side. And what that is habitat complexity, basically. You see lots of dead-end channels here, lots of looping, circling channels. All of that was amazing fish habitat and waterfowl habitat at one time. Settlement began, and we turned the place into something else for our needs. Transportation corridors, this is the Sacramento Deepwater Ship Channel here. Easier ways to move between islands, dredged out navigation channels like this. So in that 200 years, it's become a very different place. This is an example of some of the dredging that occurred. And this little thing right here is a dredger. This picture is from around the 1900s, I believe. And they would run a dredger just straight line across all these curvy channels, and they would scoop out channel bottom muck to create a navigational channel, and they'd lay it on the side. And so they'd be doing two things at once, creating a navigation channel and flood control levees. The levees were basically made out of whatever was at the bottom of the water. It's not what we consider to be good flood control material today. Among the extreme alterations that have taken place in the Delta are a huge number of invasive species. The Delta is considered by some to be the most invaded estuary in the world, more invasive species than anywhere else. This is one example. This is a striped bass, introduced in the late 1800s as a sport fish. I believe it was introduced from the East Coast. It adapted very well to the Delta. It's one of the top predators now. It's a favorite sport fish, responsible for a large share of the recreational fishing industry in the Delta. But it eats Delta smelt and young salmon, which are both native species that are declining. Another one of the alterations is water pollution from all over. You saw that first slide that showed the entire estuary, the entire watershed, 40% of the state. All of it contributes pollution to the Delta. This is just probably the single most glaring example. Sacramento's treated wastewater. It's the largest single point source of pollution in the entire Delta. About 1.4 million people in Sacramento contribute to this. We have a regional sewage treatment plant that discharges into the Sacramento River just downstream of the Freeport Bridge, if you know where that is. The sewage treatment plant is considered a secondary treatment plant. Most urban treatment systems these days are tertiary. So there's a lot of stuff in there. And one of the things in there is ammonia, which they've recently figured out contributes to a disruption of the food chain in the Delta, and maybe one of the contributing factors to the decline of Delta smelt. Not direct effects on the smelt, but effect on the food web that the smelt relies on. the regional treatment district has been ordered by the state to dramatically clean this up. It won't happen for a decade, and there are lawsuits contesting this, but it will get cleaned up. Another alteration has been essentially land development, primarily in the form of farming in the Delta. All the soils in the Delta, well, not all of them, but especially in this central part of the Delta, the soils consist of peat, which is degraded organic material. And much of this was, before we got here, was either underwater or periodically underwater. And it's cattails, tules, other plants that would die and regrow every year. And over the centuries, it accumulated dozens and dozens of feet of this peat soil. And because it's organic, when you dry it out, it oxidizes and essentially goes away. It evaporates. So when we built all the levees and began farming these islands, the soil began to oxidize. And so the levees, the islands inside the levees began to sink below sea level. And the red areas are the most deeply subsided islands. And they continue to subside, although not at the rate that they used to, because a lot of the farming practices have been improved. But one of the things that happens with this subsidence is that the levees get weaker because the interior material on the island that supports the levees falls away. So the levees are more likely to tilt inward, basically. And the strain on them from the water outside is greater. One of the concerns is that when you have a levee failure, because these islands are below sea level, when you have a levee failure, they draw water in from everywhere around the island, and especially from the west, San Francisco Bay and Sassoon Bay, which is salty. And so the concern among water planners in California is that if you had multiple island failures, you'd have a huge amount of salt water rushing in to fill those voids, which would compromise the fresh water supply that we all rely on, primarily from these two pumps here, the state and federal water supply systems that serve about 25 million people in California, from more or less from San Jose all the way to San Diego, and a lot of farmland in between, virtually all of the San Joaquin Valley, or a large share of it. So the idea is to try to avoid that catastrophe in some way. One of the ways that you could have a catastrophic failure of a number of islands like this is from an earthquake. This over here is the Hayward Fault. The San Andreas Fault is not on this map, but this is the Hayward Fault, which is considered by earthquake experts to be probably the most likely source of a major earthquake in this region in the near future. All of these other faults are smaller, relatively less active, but they're all faults near or right under the delta. So you can see there's a lot of potential ways for an earthquake to affect this area, including faults that we don't know about. This was an earthquake on October 15th, 2010 that I wrote about. It occurred on a fault that nobody knew about before, right in the middle of the delta. It was a small quake, 3.1, but nevertheless, it illustrated that we just don't know where an earthquake will hit or when. One of the concerns about this kind of an earthquake is that it could take a very long time to repair islands that flood after this kind of an earthquake. First of all, you have to pump all the water out, and meanwhile, you may need another supply for those water diversions down here. They may not be able to treat that salty water. It may damage their equipment. So everyone that relies on that water will go without. They'll have to find something else, ration, what have you. It's been estimated that if there were a number of island failures, it could take as long as 1.5 years to restore that fresh water supply. So that's a long time to ration water. The USGS has estimated that there's about a 60% chance, if I remember right, of a major earthquake by the middle of this century that could knock out a number of islands here. So that's a pretty high risk. Another factor, of course, has been growing water demand throughout the state. This shows the amount of water diverted by the pumping systems that rely on the delta. The two main ones are the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project. And you can see that it just ramped up over time as the state's population grew. We got to here, though, and it began to level off for a lot of reasons. More conservation, and frankly, a lot of strain on this water supply. We started to see the ecology of the delta collapse, a lot of fish species declining, and there were new rules put in place to protect those fish. And here we had some drought years that were very painful for a lot of people and caused a lot of controversy. There were years of litigation in here over the fish protections because of these sharp water reductions. Of course, it happened to come during the recession too, which wasn't great. There was a lot of anxiety from the farming community about how their way of life was compromised by these water cuts. Some of that harm was caused by the recession, but some of it was certainly caused by these water cuts. And this is an example of some of the environmental decline that we've seen. This is a delta smelt. That's an adult. They're very small. They're not what we here called charismatic megafauna. It's not even a salmon. But it lives nowhere else in the world. This fish only lives in the delta. And it's very sensitive to salinity. And one of the puzzling things about it is that its numbers have always been sort of unpredictable. As you can see from this chart, this is a record of population surveys for the smelt that the state has done for many years. It's been up and down a lot. A lot of this is due to just natural hydrology in the state. The population goes up and down with water flow, partly because the fish is sensitive to salinity. So its habitat changes as the salinity changes. But what happened in around here, 2002 through 2004, you see something very different happened. A long, very severe decline in the population. And it coincided with the drought that I showed on the previous chart and that steep increase in water demand. So this wasn't the only species that saw a decline like this during this period. Virtually all of the, they're called pelagic fishes because they live in the moving water column of the delta. And they all basically declined at the same time, which we hadn't ever seen before. And the experts who monitor these things and study it basically determined that it was a wholesale ecological collapse that was beginning in the delta. And it's essentially still underway. There's been a lot of measures taken since then, a lot of research done. You saw a blip in the population right here of the smelt, and that's because that was a wet year. But here we are, last year we had a dry year, and it's right back in dismal territory. This was presented at a media briefing by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service 2 weeks ago to try to explain how the rules currently work to protect the smelt. And I just stole this slide from their presentation. This was actually their title, and they sort of laughed a little bit when they presented that. Is it helpful? Well, not to you and me. This doesn't make any sense, but it explains to the scientists how they decide when they're going to order pumping reductions to protect the smelt. And it's extremely complicated. And the question, since these rules went into place in 2008, is, does it make any difference? Is it really helping the smelt? And I asked that question back in December when we had the first real pumping reductions that had been ordered under these rules in the last few years. And this is a question that's been on everybody's mind for a while, and they said, yeah, it works. And this is sort of the evidence of that. They ordered the pumping reductions on December 17th, and this shows how much water, the dashed line shows how much water was being diverted from the two major pumping systems over time. And these are the number of smelt deaths in each pumping facility. So until they ordered these reductions, they had seen 90 delta smelt killed in the pumps, and there's a hard limit on how many they can kill before tighter rules come into place. But they ordered the rules here, and you saw the deaths drop off. So it's working, but it's not solving all the problems. We have all the other problems I talked about: habitat loss, invasive species, pollution, and that's where the Bay Delta Conservation Plan kind of came into being. It aims to solve more of those problems. Not all of them. There are measures being taken for the others, but the BDCP is trying to be a little more comprehensive. What is it? Well, the thing you hear about most are the two giant water tunnels. There's also habitat restoration that's proposed on a pretty massive scale, levee improvements to sort of prevent some of the levees from failing. They're going to decide what are the critical levees and how do we make them stronger. New rules to govern how the pumps are operated. And if this gets approved, it'll be a 50-year term. So it's extremely important that it works right, because it'll be in place for decades. There will probably be provisions to modify it as they go along, but the stakes are high because many of the terms will be locked in for 50 years. This is an example of some of the habitat conservation that's planned. This map just shows tidal habitat, and I can't quite see if the yellow doesn't show up real well here, but these areas, these ROAs, that's known as a restoration opportunity area, and so these areas are being looked at now as potential tidal habitat restoration places. So under BDCP, this land would be bought up, and there's farms in many of these places now. The farms would be converted back to habitat. So clearly there's a need for more habitat, but there are consequences for the area too. There's farms that have operated here for 100 years or more. Obviously, they're very concerned about not being able to farm anymore. The tunnels are obviously a focus of a lot of attention. The latest proposal is for 3 intakes. It had been 5, but it's 3 now. It had been 15,000 cubic feet per second of tunnel capacity or diversion capacity, and it's now 9,000. The tunnels would all be located in this region, all in Sacramento County. The tunnels would begin roughly here from a forebay that the intakes divert into, and then it would be a pair of tunnels that go underground to a new forebay here that serve the 2 pumping plants. One of the goals with this plan is to allow some natural salinity variability to return to the estuary. By diverting fresh water here, higher up on the Sacramento River, you won't be forcing it to move through all of this, which artificially freshens this entire estuary. So by diverting up here, you'll allow more tidal fluctuation to come through here. This water, especially in the western part of the delta, would probably become a little more salty. And one of the reasons that's important is because some of the invasive species are here because they live in a freshwater environment, and we've turned this into a freshwater place. So by allowing some salinity to return, it might be a way to drive out some of the invasive species. One of the critical ones is a small clam that is suspected of altering the food chain in the delta by eating up all the phytoplankton and zooplankton. This tunnel project, it's not like you just dig a couple tunnels and run water through it. It's an enormous project and a huge engineering challenge. It would be 37 feet in diameter, and this picture, which I borrowed from a presentation by Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, this shows a tunnel boring machine that's 26 feet in diameter. This is a man right here. So the machines they would use would be bigger than this. And this is the rest of the machine down here. This is how they begin building one of these tunnels. The drilling machine is 2 football fields long. They would have to operate 6 of these simultaneously underground. And even doing that, and they're working 24/7, even doing that, it would take 8 years to build the tunnel. 6 machines working around the clock. And it would take a total of 12 years to finish the project, counting all of the diversion points and forebays and other systems. Now, that previous slide showed a tunnel machine going into a hill. And that's not possible in the Delta because there are no hills. So they have to build vertical shafts just to get the machine underground. And not only that, but they have to build levees to protect this opening. Levees that can withstand a 200-year flood, which we don't have a lot of levees in California that meet that standard now. So there are some in Sacramento. They're enormous levees, and they're very expensive and complicated in themselves. So these are some examples of how big this project is. More concrete than Hoover Dam. The material that's dug out for the tunnel would cover a football field 1,000 stories high. That's about 10,000 feet of mud that has to be dredged out and taken somewhere. And enough steel to go around the world twice. The intakes themselves would be very large. This is an old map. It shows 5 intakes. That's not the plan anymore. Some of you are probably East Bay Mud customers. They recently built, in partnership with Sacramento County, a water intake in Freeport on the Sacramento River. It's 6 acres in size. Each one of the 3 BDCP canal intakes would be 40 acres. So more than 6 times the size of this. And if you've ever driven up I-5 heading to Sacramento and looked to the left, you may have seen this. It's a very large facility. The intake along the Sacramento River is about a football field long. These are fish screens in here, and the intakes will have similar. So, will it work? Nobody knows yet. This is one of my favorite editorial cartoons from our former editorial cartoonist Rex Babin. It fits with your theme today. Water is more valuable than gold in California. We're prepared to do a lot to keep it flowing. But whether BDCP works is still to be decided, and it's going to take a lot of people like you paying attention to make sure that it works right. One of the big questions about BDCP is governance. Who's going to control the tunnels and the pumping? How are we going to know what they're doing? Are they diverting too much? All kinds of questions like that are going to decide whether it's good for fish or not. So I'd love to have your questions.
Are canals likely to be damaged by, more or less likely to be damaged by earthquakes than the levees?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been told that they believe the tunnel will be earthquake-proof. The way it's actually constructed, you saw the tunnel boring machine. One of the things it does, and one of the reasons it's so big, is it moves precast tunnel segments that are assembled underground. The tunnel walls are 2 feet thick concrete, and these arced segments are moved underground and assembled to create the walls of the tunnel. We don't know. We don't know. They say that it will be earthquake-proof, but we don't know.
You didn't talk about housing, but we have a question. What can or should be done to prevent more housing on the Delta?
Well, housing subdivisions are already banned in the Delta. You can build a house in the Delta, but it's got to be on a rural piece of property, and it's not dense housing. And generally, it has to be raised above the floodplain. So there is new housing development going on in the Delta. Since many of you have been there, you've seen new houses in a lot of places. It's not a good thing, but it's probably not actually creating a lot of new public safety risk, to be honest. At least that's my perception.
Is there any hope to restore salmon runs through the Delta? Would drastic actions be needed to do this?
Yeah, there's a lot going on with that. I didn't talk about salmon before, but salmon, of course, are different. They don't live in the Delta. They just migrate through. But one of the problems with salmon is we've eliminated a lot of their habitat, too, by building dams. Dams feed the fresh water through the Delta that we all depend on. There are separate new rules governing salmon restoration, and one of the big ones is that the water agencies, particularly the federal agencies that control some of the big dams, they're going to be required to get salmon over those dams again. It's a huge undertaking that's very expensive. It may mean fish ladders. It may mean what they call a trap and haul program, where you actually herd the fish, put them in trucks, drive them around the dam, and then let them go again. And then you have to do the same thing with the young salmon that are born in the river above the dams. It's very complicated, but they've decided that it's necessary, partly because of climate change. We're losing the cold water that they need below the dams, so we need to be able to get them back to the cold water that's left at higher elevations. So yeah, those are drastic actions, and they are required. There are deadlines to meet in the years pretty close ahead.
When pumping reductions are ordered to protect smelt, who is most impacted, and have plans or tactics been developed to assist those impacted?
Probably a portion of the farmers in the San Joaquin Valley are impacted. And that's because particularly Westland's water district, which irrigates, it's the largest agricultural irrigation district in the world. It irrigates a huge section of the San Joaquin Valley, primarily in Fresno County. And they're totally reliant on Delta water, or nearly so. So when the water's cut back, you hear about it most from them. One of the changes, however, that's made it more harmful for them and others is there's been a switch from annual crops to permanent crops in a lot of these places, and some of it's economic. As the cost of everything goes up, farmers need to find a way to break even or continue to profit. So they've gotten into higher value permanent crops such as citrus, wine grapes, things like that. The problem with that is you can't idle permanent crops when you have a drought, when you have a water shortage. So they end up sometimes having to take out trees, which makes for very dramatic images in the media, and frankly, harmful economic effects for them. So they're probably the most heavily impacted. Was there a second part to that question? Oh, what's being done to help them when that happens? Well, crop insurance, federal crop insurance, which you've been hearing about lately because of the drought in the Midwest. It's a controversial concept in itself. So some of the farms in the San Joaquin Valley benefit from crop insurance. Many of them also benefit from crop subsidies to grow certain things in the first place. So that's a whole other complex thing.
Okay, next question. What would be the implication of not doing anything? Who would be suffering?
Well, the do nothing option is certainly out there. If we don't like the way BDCP looks, if it doesn't get approved, if it's tied up in lawsuits for years, like it probably will be no matter what. Who suffers? Well, the environment suffers. All those fish species we talked about will continue to struggle. We'll continue, all of us will be more likely to see dramatic shifts in water availability, which is what makes conservation an ever-present good idea. You'll see a lot more controversy about farming in the San Joaquin Valley and what people decide to grow. There's been arguments made that, maybe maybe they should be required to adopt conservation measures. They're not currently. There's still a great deal of flood irrigation that takes place in the San Joaquin Valley. Drip irrigation is expensive, so perhaps subsidies for that kind of thing are in order. There's also been talk that, maybe you just shouldn't be allowed to grow certain water-thirsty crops in dry places. So those are the kinds of consequences that could play out in the future.
I think this will be the final question. What issues will you be covering in 2013-14 regarding Delta water issues?
Well, I would say it's probably going to be all about the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. They're supposed to be out with a draft environmental impact report next month. Actually, what I last heard was late this month it's supposed to be out, but it's been postponed many times, and it probably will be postponed again. But it's such a complex thing, such a complex document. Thousands and thousands of pages. You've heard a little bit about how complex the Delta is. I'm sure I won't be able to read the whole document. I don't know if anybody will. So just trying to understand that proposal is going to take up a lot of my time. And so that's why I'm pleased that all of you are here to talk about this today and try to learn about that plan and California water in general. So thank you very much.